Look closely at Rome's most famous arena. One entire outer wall is gone. Where did it go? By the time you finish this video, you will have a map of the missing half. Not a single ruin to point at, but a trail that runs through the Vatican, across palaces and churches, and into the very mortar and lime of the city itself. The Colosseum we see today is only part of what the Flavian emperors razed almost 2 millennia ago. The rest didn't vanish in a single dramatic catastrophe. It was unpacked, carried away, reshaped and scattered, and in some cases burned down to make new things. If you enjoy uncovering Rome's hidden histories and following where the stones actually went, consider subscribing to the channel. We publish new videos every day, each one tracing how ancient power, architecture, and memory still shape the city around us. Built under the Flavians in the late 1st century CE, the amphitheater we call the Coliseum was a technical and social statement. Vespasian began the project and Titus opened it. Domitian made later modifications. The exterior once rose roughly 50 meters, wrapped in 3 tiers of arches and a top story with windows. An enormous ring of travertine and tufa capable of seating 50,000 people or more. Inside, the arena hosted gladiators and animal hunts, naval reenactments when the ground was flooded, public executions and spectacles that made the emperor's generosity visible to the city. Its popular nickname, the Coliseum, came from the nearby colossal statue, originally associated with Nero, that gave a visual anchor to the site and to the idea of grandeur itself. So if it was built to be that massive and durable, how did half of it go missing? The short answer is that time had many hands. Rome's population shrank, its coffers thinned, and public spectacles became less frequent. The empire stopped sending the same levels of money and people to maintain the enormous machine of games. Overlaying that long decline were environmental shocks, most importantly earthquakes, and the enduring human impulse to reuse valuable building stone. The two processes worked together. A quake might break and destabilize a wall, and if that wall no longer served its original purpose, nearby builders saw opportunity rather than ruin. This is where the story gets modern and messy. Imagine the Colosseum as a giant game of Jenga, a tower of precisely cut blocks held together by gravity and mortar. Pull out a few keystones and the whole face becomes vulnerable. Lift out dozens, and a whole section will slump. Over centuries, blocks were removed systematically. Some were taken as dressed blocks, ready to be set into new facades. Some were broken and burned in kilns to make lime for mortar. Some were fed into new constructions with little change. The result was a redistribution of a monument into the city's fabric. That quarrying was not random or purely illicit. Rome, like every living city, recycled. Churches, palaces, and civic buildings needed good stone. The Colosseum offered a convenient and centrally located quarry. Records from the papal chancery and other archives show that removal was sometimes authorized. One well-cited example, sources indicate that Pope Nicholas V authorized the removal of large quantities of stone from the Colosseum, a figure recorded in some documents as 2,522 loads. Whether every load went directly to one project or was counted precisely in the way modern accounting would demand, the number itself testifies to an organized, large-scale program of reuse in the 15th century. Where did those stones go? If you wander through Rome and the Vatican, you are literally walking on fragments of the Colosseum's afterlife. At the top of the list is St. Peter's Basilica and the broader Vatican complex. For centuries, St. Peter's was a running project, rebuilt and reimagined in the Renaissance and Baroque eras, and the papacy drew material from several ancient monuments in the city. The old Lateran Basilica, St. John Lateran, also benefited from spolia salvaged from Roman ruins. Civic palaces, too, swallowed up Colosseum stone. Palazzo Farnese, with its severe Renaissance facade, displays blocks and a quality of stone that documentary sources and architectural historians connect to the scavenged travertine used around the city. Palazzo Senatorio, high on the Capitoline Hill, and Palazzo Barberini, expanded under the Barberini family during the papacy of Urban VIII, are among the high-profile structures where material removed from ancient monuments found new life. Urban VIII's Barberini Circle is often singled out in contemporary sources, sometimes criticized for drawing heavily on antiquities to build modern prestige, but this criticism sits inside a longer tradition in which the remains of one era fuel the ambitions of the next. Not everything taken from the Coliseum went intact into a facade. Some blocks were split and burned to make lime, an irreversible transformation. Where a column or an arch once stood, only chemically altered dust remained. That fact changes how we should imagine loss. It is not only that the missing stones are now embedded in palaces, some of them simply ceased to be stone at all and entered the invisible history of mortar and plaster. When we ask, where is the lost half, part of the answer is that a portion of it is physically unrecoverable, spread as lime through the reconstructions and renovations of later centuries. The dramatic partial collapse of the Colosseum's outer shell in the mid-14th century is a key moment in this narrative, but it is not the whole story. The earthquake, commonly dated to around 1349, undermined and toppled large sections of the structure, most notably the southern exterior wall. But that collapse was the consequence of long-term neglect and of the slow process of material removal. Once one face came down, the remaining blocks were even easier to take. Over the following 100 years, scavengers and organized work crews took advantage of its vulnerability. In other words, the quake created openings the quarrymen widened. Nature and human industry collaborated, if unwillingly, in the Colosseum's rearrangement. The medieval period is particularly revealing for how people repurposed and reinterpreted the amphitheater. Far from being a ruin left only to decay, the Colosseum became a living patchwork of uses. Parts of the interior were converted into dwellings and workshops. Some sections were fortified by noble families looking for defensible positions inside the city. Medieval documents and chronicles suggest that families, often named in sources with spellings that vary, occupied and adapted parts of the monument for practical needs. Among the names that appear in records, versions of Frangipani and Annibaldi are sometimes cited as owning or fortifying parts of the site, though spellings and identifications can be inconsistent in the surviving documents. Small aristocratic enclaves, tenants, craftsmen, and even monastic communities used the arches and interiors as spaces for everyday life. In this period, the Colosseum was not so much a ruin as a neighborhood, a place with household economies, stables, workshops, and gardens, shoehorned into ancient masonry. Medieval imaginings also recast the amphitheater's identity. Lacking modern archaeological language, many in the Middle Ages groped for explanations, producing myths rather than histories. Some described it as a temple or palace, others tied it to legendary figures like Virgil and fanciful stories that attributed the site's origins to magic or imperial caprice. Another enduring medieval memory theme was the belief that the Colosseum had been a site of Christian martyrdom. That belief became widespread in later centuries, shaping devotional practices and interpretation, but historians point out that firm documentary evidence pinpointing such executions in the arena is thin. It is safer to describe martyrdom at the Colosseum as a later, widely held tradition rather than as a thoroughly documented fact. If medieval Rome treated the Colosseum as an urban resource, the Renaissance and Baroque centuries treated it as an architectural quarry and a resource for political symbolism. Papal building projects required expensive materials, and the Colosseum was a tempting source, yet at the same time the popes themselves would later be central to its preservation, a striking reversal that reveals how attitudes changed. In the 17th and 18th centuries, growing antiquarian interest and a different set of religious and rhetorical priorities led to protectionist interventions. Pope Benedict XIV in the mid-18th century was a key figure. He forbade further quarrying and encouraged a new reading of the monument, promoting the idea of the Colosseum as a Christian memorial, a place for reflection on suffering and valor rather than simply a quarry to be plundered. His actions helped to stop the systematic removal of stone, even as earlier centuries of taking could not be undone. That protective impulse, however, carried a historical irony. 19th-century archaeologists and restoration architects, eager to expose and celebrate the Roman imperial layer, began to strip away centuries of later accretions, the very medieval neighborhoods, staircases, and mortuary chapels that told the story of the Colosseum's life after antiquity. The archaeological recovery of ancient fabric was deemed progress, but it also erased valuable traces of the site's medieval and modern uses. Restoration sometimes meant replacing one historical layer with another, and in that sense, archaeological recovery performed a form of destruction. The irony is sharp. A city that had long consumed its ancient stones in the name of building later prized those same stones for their ancientness, and in attempting to reveal them, removed the evidence of the city's continuous occupation. Among the more vivid examples of reuse are the palaces and churches whose very facades may conceal blocks once lodged in the Coliseum. Walk the streets between the Vatican and the Capitoline and you're likely treading on or passing walls that contain repurposed travertine. Palazzo Farnese, with its celebrated courtyard and massive profile, is one of the Renaissance showpieces associated with spolia from earlier monuments. Palazzo Senatorio still bears visible signs where ancient stone entered civic architecture. The Barberini expansions under Urban VIII's papacy used ancient material, not always discreetly, and contemporary watchers accused those in power of stripping the city's classical heritage to build Baroque grandeur. These critiques, often voiced by antiquarians as much as by moralists, underscore how reuse could be both pragmatic and controversial. And then there is the simple fact of loss by transformation: lime. When blocks were burned in lime kilns, they dissolved into a substance that mixed into mortar, making them impossible to identify centuries later. For those stones, there is no destination to map on a modern tour of Rome. Their presence is only detectable in the chemical composition of later masonry or in the historical records that note their burning. That partial annihilation of material complicates any tidy inventory of the lost half. Not everything survived to be built into a new monument where we can point and say, that came from the Coliseum. So how should we answer the title's question? Where to find the lost half? The answer has multiple layers. Literally, pieces of the Colosseum's missing shell are embedded in St. Peter's Basilica and other parts of the Vatican. In the Lateran complex, in the walls of Palazzo Farnese, Palazzo Senatorio, Palazzo Barberini, and scattered through countless churches and civic buildings. Some stones are visible as reused blocks with bossed faces and Roman tooling marks. Others may be hidden behind plaster or rebuilt into foundations. More philosophically, the lost half is in the lime that built other walls, in the mortar under later floors, in the muscles of Rome's urban life that were literally fed by its stones. And beyond materiality, the missing half exists in the stories Rome tells about itself. The medieval myths, the Renaissance controversies, the 18th century awakenings and 19th century restorations that prioritized one past over another. This distributive answer matters for how we think about conservation and heritage. Treating monuments as static objects ignores the fact that cities are palimpsests, surfaces rewritten by each generation. The Colosseum is not a single-layered artifact frozen at its imperial peak. It is a complex living record of reuse and reinterpretation. Yet the choices that later centuries made, what to protect, what to remove, what to celebrate, shape what our generation can read from its stones. The 19th century focus on exposing imperial Rome recovered a particular past but erased the evidence of medieval life. In contrast, more recent heritage practice tries to preserve multiple layers, to respect a monument's many lives, rather than project a single idealized one back onto it. There is also a moral subtlety. It is tempting to lament the loss as simple vandalism. How could people tear apart so magnificent a building? But that framing strips agency from people living in a city with immediate needs and shifting priorities. For hundreds of years, reusing ancient stone was practical, often legal, and even rhetorically acceptable. Papal permissions, documented sales, and organized transport all indicate that the removal had institutional dimensions as well as private ones. At the same time, the protective turn by Benedict XV and later conservators shows how values change. What once was a source of building material became an object of reverence. Walking around the Colosseum today, you can still sense those overlapping lives. Look at the ragged line where the outer wall is missing, and imagine the route those blocks took. Down from the arches, loaded onto carts, hauled across cobbles, inserted into new thresholds and facades. Think of the men who burned stone into lime under makeshift kilns, of the families who turned arches into homes, of the craftsmen who shaped those blocks into columns for new patrons. The missing half is not a single absence, but a dispersed presence, everywhere and nowhere at once. If you've stood in St. Peter's or climbed the Capitoline, you've likely brushed against fragments of that dispersed half without knowing it. The polite stone of a Renaissance palace, the rough boss left on a reused block, the mortar in an old wall. These are the Colosseum's afterlives. Even where we cannot point to a specific block and say with certainty that one came from the amphitheater, the city's architecture as a whole carries the imprint of the Colosseum's redistribution. So when we ask the lost half of the Coliseum where to find it, the best short answer is this: scattered across Rome, in major churches and palaces that once needed stone, in the lime of countless rebuilt walls, and in the less tangible but no less real traces of medieval neighborhoods now erased. The loss is both physical and historical. Some stones were built into St. Peter's and palaces. Some were burned into lime. Some vanished when restorers cleared away medieval layers in pursuit of a purer, ancient past. The Colosseum we tour today is beautiful and awe-inspiring, but it is also a palimpsest whose missing half has been written into the rest of the city. As you leave the image of the missing wall in your mind, consider this final thought. Monuments do not simply belong to the era that built them. They are made and remade by the needs, dreams, and politics of those who follow. The stones of the Colosseum live on elsewhere, and that redistribution is a kind of continuity. Messy, ironic, sometimes painful, but deeply human. If this journey through Rome's material afterlife has intrigued you, consider subscribing to the channel. We publish new videos every day, each one exploring how ancient power, architecture, and memory continue to shape the world we inherit.